President Biden is ramping up pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to put an end to the deadly fighting. The two discussed the conflict on a call yesterday, with the president telling his Israeli counterpart that he expects a, quote, significant de-escalation. Weijia Jiang joins us now from the White House with more on this. So Weijia, this is sort of a departure from the behind-the-scenes diplomacy the White House has said it was participating in. What I find really interesting going forward is, first of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday said that the campaign would end when he thought it should end. So this is really kind of the first big test for President Biden when it comes to international diplomatic efforts, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. In other words, is the United States able to influence its allies and its partners or not?
Right, because now, at least publicly, the ball is in President Biden's court, because he did say he had an expectation for de-escalation yesterday. And you're right, Prime Minister Netanyahu issued his own statement that said, "I am determined to continue this operation until its objective is achieved, to restore quiet and security to the citizens of Israel." The Prime Minister also included some language that President Biden used in their first three conversations that they had over the phone, saying that he appreciated the president's support of Israel's right to defend itself, because, of course, that is what we kept hearing from the president, despite mounting pressure from members of his own party to call for a ceasefire. And so what we don't know is exactly what happened between that conversation, the third call that they had, and this one, where President Biden clearly changed his language and was a lot firmer with the prime minister. We don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes, but certainly publicly we saw those Democrats banding together, calling for more urgent action, more support of the Palestinian people. So you have to imagine that probably factored into the president changing his stance a little bit. But the principal deputy White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was on board Air Force One when this news broke. And we heard our colleague, Nancy Cortez, along with several other reporters, really press her on what changed and what led to this firmer stance. And she did not provide any clarity, just saying that, the statements speak for themselves. But there's certainly a lot of context here that's missing that hopefully we will learn about later today when there's another White House briefing.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift gears a little bit. President Biden is set to sign the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law today. Can you just remind us what this measure is supposed to enact? What is the hope for this measure?
Well, the hope is that this provides more resources to try to curb the number of anti-Asian hate incidents that we've seen surge since the pandemic first started. So there will be a new position at the Department of Justice to handle and to expedite allegations of hate crimes. It will also direct the DOJ and Health and Human Services Secretary to work with various organizations to give guidance to help victims report these incidents and to raise public awareness. It will also give grants to train local law enforcement to identify hate crimes and for states to set up reporting hotlines. But some advocates are concerned that the bill doesn't go far enough to address the underlying causes of the attacks or do anything to help clarify what constitutes a hate crime, which is where a lot of this gets held up. And they are also frustrated that the law will not allocate any new funding for the API community. And so even though there is agreement that this is a critical first step, I've talked to a lot of advocates who say it is only the first step and a lot more has to be done in the future if we're really going to start bringing these attacks down.
So, yeah, we should talk a little bit more about that because I know you filed this piece for CBS this morning. There are some advocates who say that the bill doesn't go far enough. Describe some of the other criticisms that they have. I mean, it is striking that this is the one piece of legislation that did receive bipartisan support both in the House and in the Senate, except for one, Josh Hawley, who chose to vote against it. But what are some of those issues, digging a little deeper?
Well, so advocates are worried that, again, there's not enough resources to address some of the root problems and systemic racism within the AAPI community that maybe has led to some of this discrimination against the vulnerable population. So they want money to go specifically toward housing and health care and things that will make the playing field more equal. And they're also worried that the real problem here, Vlad, is a lack of education. And, there's a lot of Asian American history that the children, the next generation, they're not learning in schools right now. And so they are really pressing for the Department of Education to incorporate that into studies. And so, it will take time and perhaps a couple generations for us to really understand the role of AAPIs in this country's long history. But they do think that will make a difference because, again, one of the big underlying problems is the perception of Asian Americans as foreigners, perpetual foreigners, as the other. And so if you start to learn about everything that the community has contributed to the history of this country, then the hope is that that starts to go away and that this, view of Asian Americans starts to change and could lead to more inclusion and less discrimination.
Weijia, it's such an important point that you make. It's become striking in just the last year or so, last couple of years, I should say, how what many people perceive to be old history or ancient history is actually living history. And we have many examples of that, from somebody yesterday testifying on the Hill who's 107 years old, who lived through the Tulsa massacre, to Jodi Kantor's grandmother appearing on CBS this morning to talk about her experiences in the Holocaust, juxtaposed with those images of angry young white men saying Jews will not replace us, and now to this, where, if you polled people on the streets of this city or most American cities and you said, do you know who Vincent Chin is? I don't know that you would get a lot of positive responses. I mean, there was a poll that came out just a couple of weeks ago, maybe Weijia, you're familiar with it, that asked Americans to just name prominent Asians living today. And people struggle to do that. I mean, I think the response that, was Bruce Lee, who died many, many years ago. And so Vincent Chin was a man who was killed in 1982 because of some of the very things that we're talking about right now. And it strikes me that education is a big chunk of this. And if that's not part of this legislation, or if there isn't enough money allocated to educate people, then we're destined, sadly doomed, to repeat some of these mistakes.
Right, and that's why they feel it's so important to change that, because we don't know who Vincent Chin is. I didn't learn about who he was in school, and you're right, he was a man who was targeted in a bar because at the time, the Japanese manufacturing industry of cars was really taking off, and there was a lot of frustration that American jobs were being lost. And so, he was out celebrating his bachelor party, and because of his face, because he looked Japanese to his attackers, and he wasn't, by the way, he's a Chinese American, they started a conflict, and it ended with him losing his life. And so that's the backdrop. Again, a lot of researchers are pointing to something very similar now, that there's this economic frustration because of COVID, just like there was frustration back then because those auto jobs were being lost. All that to say that, had people known about that case, had people been aware, who knows what kind of difference that would make, but that's just one very small example. The first group of first group of people to ever be banned from immigrating to America were the Chinese, and I think people don't realize that, despite all the anger that we've seen from the previous administration's ban on Muslims. So I think that, that is exactly why, you're right, Vlad, that these advocates hope that if we just understand each other a little bit better, then that, will lead to more positive results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, speaking of positive, at least there was an overwhelming bipartisan support for it, with the exception, as you pointed out, Vlad, of one Republican. Weijia, thank you so much.
Sure.